One night I did a review of an alleged congressional hearing concerning MK Ultra that happened in the late 70s. And among the things it discussed was how, specifically in the Bay Area of California, there was a process and a system whereby they would use prostitutes, as they identified them, they were prostitutes, to lure people into some sort of party situation and engage them in drug use, including giving them drugs without telling them that they were being given drugs. And the whole point was to have a surveillance system set up where they would be filmed on drugs. And presumably, this was part of some sort of experiment to see how people would react to being exposed to these specific drugs. In the report, it listed and identified certain kinds of drugs. But the ironic thing is, in the report, they have some dialogue, I guess you could say, as part of the testimony. And the names that were in that particular report definitely demonstrate that there was not a complete forthcomingness about who had access to what knowledge and information and what they were doing with it. But the important part was an understanding that by the 70s, that the CIA was running a covert program to use prostitutes to inure people into situations where they were going to be drugged, including secretly, not exclusively, but including secretly drugged so someone could spy on them to see how they would react. Now, as the years have gone on, there's been a lot of talk in certain circles about MK Ultra and what it entails, and the various programs that are associated with it, which may even include some discussion about programs going all the way back to testing around Area 51 and places in the Southwest where there were nuclear tests and things associated with what they were doing in those nuclear tests that I contend are actually a part of it as well. But this correlation of the use of prostitutes and drugs as a behavioral science phenomena has a different kind of implication now than if that specific congressional hearing report I found is accurate to the time. Because concurrent to that time frame, as was revealed by somebody alleged to be very highly placed within the archives of the KGB, once he left the Soviet Union, came to the United States, he began translating and transcribing notes he had compiled. And there was an archive of this that was put together and financed, actually, if I'm not mistaken, by the Rockefeller Foundation. And in the course of this, there was all of this information about the operations of the KGB. And among the things the KGB would do was something similar to MK Ultra, that it would use drugs, specifically marijuana and hashish, including in the area around Afghanistan and Pakistan, in order to attempt to infiltrate the political paradigm in those areas and try to influence people's relationships with certain people based upon blackmailing them after they had been exposed to drugs. They would use drugs to try to set it up in circumstances, and I contend that there was multiple context around this. It wasn't just about those people engaging in drug use and then other people finding out they used drugs, and because they used drugs all of a sudden it was a problem or it was a scandal. In the 60s, 70s, early 80s especially, using certain kinds of drugs, especially marijuana, and certain political tendencies had a different implication outside of the United States than it did in the United States. And also within certain political contexts, it wasn't anathema. It was actually a form of social bonding, right? And that there were these different connotations around what it meant to maybe share a joint, for instance, or to share some hash, including if you're talking about particular kinds of political organizing. I think that part of what this was mostly about was about getting that person to use the drugs and then putting them in a situation where something else happened politically or socially. And then what it ended up doing is getting the high itself impacted. That people who thought, well, it was okay to engage in social bonding around drugs didn't want to be put in a situation where what they were trying to promulgate as somehow liberatory or bonding with each other around the satisfaction and the pleasure they got when it came to drugs use were scandalized by something somebody else had done that was then associated with drugs and then impacted them on a political level. They had to make a political decision about the role of drug use in what they would consider to be legitimate political activity. And I think that this is what the KGB exploited. And they did it in a way, at least according to some of the information that's in the Matroshkin files, they did it in a way that actually marginalized and altogether disenfranchised political tendencies within Afghanistan specifically, but also other areas, at least around that area, that were mentioned in these reports. It was specific and strategic to use the drugs not only to try to blackmail somebody, but to use the drugs to create divisions and divisiveness within the actual sector, within the actual party, for specifically political reasons, but to make the drug use a political issue. And so this gets into a very real issue, including around trust. Can you trust somebody that is going to compromise other political priorities because they are trying to make drug usage or the pleasure or the excitation they get out of engaging in drugs, including in a ritual, including in some form of social bonding, but especially including the economy, including political economy, that is available when one engages in drug use, either as a bonding or even as a form of commerce? Can you trust your comrades if they get high to not say something that's going to put the rest of the people in a compromising position? Can you trust your comrade that if they don't have access that they to that particular drug that they're still going to be able to engage in the manner that keeps the morale going? Is addiction going to be something that defines the actual internal dynamic of the political milieu? Are you then going to use that as leverage on other people politically, or are you going to be able to adjust in some manner that doesn't allow? These are all psychosocial matters that go on anyway in any sort of political organizing. But if you have a sect or tendency that might have a compelling political platform or might be placed in a very provocative decision at a very important time, and you want to disengage them, then one of the most common tactics is to find the weak link. And one of the best ways to find the weak link is, even if you're in a context where there's some contextualization for around understanding certain kinds of intoxicants as being a social bonding, then you exploit it. Because not only are you compelling, you're calling the question politically. Is this vice or is this indulgence? Is this worth risking the movement? You say you hold to this politic, you say you hold to this. It is a dear thing. This is a core aspect of you. This is the essence of who you are. What are you willing to what are you willing to risk it for these other things that might seem superfluous? Especially if you're talking about armed struggle. If you're talking about militancy, including in a manner that allows for the possibility of armed struggle as accomplishing legitimate political ends for your people, then necessarily the role of intoxicants as a part of that is going to have to factor in a very primary manner, if nothing else, about making sure you can trust people to take that kind of risk. And if they do take that kind of risk, are they going to be able to be trustworthy to go out in that manner and go out in that effort and not cause enemies that you don't need? And see, the Soviets were very good at this. Maybe too good. Because now we're in this situation where time has gone on, and I contend that a lot of what was happening during the 80s, a lot of what led up to the situation concerning Iran Contra, was not so much about what was going on here in the Western Hemisphere, specifically around cocaine, but had to do with what was to become in later years the opiate epidemic. Specifically because opiates and the role of opiates not only hearkened to time frames when there was a political project that had disempowered and disengaged a lot of possibilities in China at a very important time, a specific kind of drug warfare that is being meted out now in another manner with all of its racist intensity. But also because in the process of technology expanding and the kinds of cybernetics that were already being engaged, including during the 70s in a conscious manner, were going to necessarily be painful. And the manners in which people attenuated themselves and adjusted themselves consciously to engaging with or through the pain was going to say a lot about how much you could get away with dominating or subordinating their consciousness to some external operator. And if you could find a way to accomplish operational objectives, including in a manner that was more easily accomplished because people's will were sublimated or they agreed to accede because they were either alleviated from having pain in the adjustment or they were even stimulated or excitated to some feeling of pleasure, then the actual command of consciousness could be relinquished. The question becomes to whom? Do you trust somebody else to have control of your consciousness? This is still going on to this day. And this is why, ultimately, it doesn't make any sense to me, even if we take out of a consideration the fact that there are people in other countries that have said for a very long time to people in America, stop making, in their own way, stop making excuses for trying to legalize drugs. It's very akin to what people were saying about using the model of prostitution and legal prostitution from parts of Europe and an understanding of how to deal with the so-called sex trade in the United States. That legalizing prostitution doesn't stop exploitation. What it does is it creates subaltern cultures of hyper exploited individuals that just can't compete at the same market rate that the people who got the inroads can. And so what you got is a bureaucratization of vice. You got vice apparatchiks all over the place, and some of them are in government. And the truth of the matter is, if you told me to go out and just act on command without questioning, I don't trust any of you. I can't. I see this every day. And so this is one of the major this is the major reason I cannot and will not support legalization of marijuana. And I cannot and will not support an effort to try to allow what is actually underlying and defining the crimes, the actual crimes associated with the so-called opiate epidemic. It's complete hypocrisy for anybody in this country especially to be talking about green energy or climate justice without getting to the essence of and the actual material reality behind what the real crimes of the opiate epidemic are, period. This is one of the reasons we haven't done very important basic education around cybernetics. This is one of the reasons we don't talk at all about what a biological weapon actually is. And it's one of the reasons why we don't hear anything about protests that have been going on for a substantial amount of time regarding the rollout of 5G. These were all things that we needed to be focused on right now, and we needed to be able to attune our consciousness as necessary so we could be honest about what we could actually take and what we were unwilling to accept. And then tactics could be adjusted accordingly, and people could potentially be rotated in and out in a manner that doesn't trigger and constantly reaffirm the triggering of intentional misrepresentation of the justification for certain kinds of isolation or gaslighting in the course of trying to modify behavior. And this is part of what's been going on for a long time. And I hope that this kind of brings some things out now that we can be more honest with, because I'm very concerned. I am not in any way, shape, or form, and I've said this for years, there's no way that I would allow for you to obligate me or my people to more debt than what we already have, because it's not debt. And this is the problem you have. We're not debtors. We're not in debt. That's not what any of this was. These were political decisions. about terms regarding how you are going to do your duty and how you're going to be able to provide for what all of us are required to provide as part of our time on earth, which is much more comprehensive than just our right to pleasure or be pleasured. It's not always convenient to focus on convenience. And so I'm just going to remind you again, why has there not been any case bought? For instance, I just want to close out by saying, has there been any case that was filed challenging any ballot initiative in the last election requesting the legalization of marijuana or any ballot measures connected to marijuana policy in this country? Why not? Why not? I know right here in Texas, I tried to bring cases about other ballot initiatives. I have for a substantial amount of time. Tax waivers, including on pets and spouses, pension fraud, I'm sorry, adjustments to the pension system, including rates of amortization on real property available for consideration, confidentiality laws, including confidentiality regarding terms on bidding for contracts with the state. While people have been hustling and clamoring for legal marijuana, that's what they've been getting away with year by year by year by year. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable.